So I'm very pleased, like every year, to introduce to you Professor Joost Lumens. Professor Joost Lumens is Professor of Computational Cardiology in Maastricht in the Netherlands. So you will move from a slightly different subject from previously, because you will enter the realm of the heart mechanics, but as you already see, Joost uses a kind of modelization of the hemodynamics of the heart, which allows to predict or to understand particularly the consequences of, for example, intra or interventricular conduction disturbances and their impact on the mechanics. And you understand that I find very useful in understanding of how cardiorevascularization therapy works or doesn't work. Okay, so Joost, the floor is to you. He just told me that he has to leave us at 5 p.m. sharp, so that's why I asked you to go back a little bit. Joost, thank you again.
Thank you, and thanks for having me on the program again, like previous years. And it's always a pleasure to share some of our work. Well, I'm Joost from Maastricht, as already introduced, and I'm a biomedical engineer by training. I actually did my postdoc in Bordeaux. That was the year before the Lyric Institute, where you all are right now, was actually being founded, let's say. The building you are right now didn't exist at that time. That was in 2011. And I did research in the hospital Au l'Évêque, which is very close to where you are. You probably know and heard about it. And that's where I worked on the devices department together with Pierre Baudachard and Sylvain Ploux. Today I want to share some of our research we did not so long ago, I would say, over the past few years, but still in the field of cardiac pacing and cardiac mechanics and hemodynamics. But first, I'm from Maastricht. It's called the Cardiovascular Research Institute in Maastricht. We collaborate quite a lot with the Lyric Institute in many ways. The institute really consists of 3 major teams. That's blood, vessels, and the heart. Well, I'm embedded in the heart division, and there we focus on research in structural heart failure and complex arrhythmia. And well, on paper, I'm embedded in this sub-team, but actually I think the modeling that we do connects those 2 fields very much. So I don't feel really into this team, but really in between. And that's also the role we have as modelers, is to build bridges, certainly scientifically. Well, what is modeling? I maybe you already had an introduction to modeling, or you will get one from other speakers. I just want to share with you how I look at it, and that also I think is pretty well expressed by the more application-driven pieces of research that I will present later. In fact, in clinic, but also in the lab, we obtain all sorts of information, and you may recognize some of these images. This is typically information you can get from echocardiography, so blood flow velocities, tissue velocities. We can get strain, myocardial deformation, which gives you some insight into the contractile status, but also the diastolic function here, the filling phase, as you can see here. And of course, electrical measurements. And well, this is the EP summer course. I will mostly talk about how certain electrophysiological problems in the heart will translate into pump failure, if you will. but also the mechanical consequences at a regional and global level. So what a cardiologist does is obtain this information of the patient and then quantify and interpret and integrate. Why? To get an idea what are the system properties and where do things go wrong in case of a patient. And very often those are physics related properties of either tissue, valves, but also the vessels and so on. So here you see some system properties that we try to quantify from non-invasive information that is available in the daily clinic. And well, as an engineer, we can call that effects, what we can measure, but also causes, and those causes and effects are actually related. And sometimes we understand that quite well. There are still, of course, gaps of knowledge where we don't really know the relationships, and then we assume certain models. But you can express this as a mathematical relation, and actually in clinical practice, cardiologists model more than they realize, because they do use Ohm's law, Laplace's law, or Bernoulli's law, for example. If you measure the flow velocity through a stenotic valve, you want to know the pressure gradient across the valve, and that is in the guidelines. It's being used for clinical decision taking, whether or not to replace a valve. That actually is modeling. In essence, that's exactly the same what we do. Albeit that we try to describe the dynamic behavior of that complex cardiovascular system, and that makes it a lot harder, of course, and also it behaves very nonlinear, like every biological system, basically. And well, there are many purposes that we do model for. Most of all, that is understanding mechanisms. But more recently, we are getting closer and closer to clinic, meaning that I think in due time there will be modeling that takes a role in clinical decision taking and the support of that. I will show you a little bit of that at the end. Okay, so that system is very multi-scale, as you can understand. We know a lot about proteins and cellular processes, about the cell. It's actually a miracle how calcium in the cell is being released and is being translated into force. How does a cardiomyocyte actually develop force based on calcium? Well, quite a lot of processes there are understood, but there are still some processes and very elemental processes that we do not fully understand. There is a function at tissue level, and in the end, we end up with this pump that makes sure that our body receives enough blood at different conditions. So it's not very trivial to link a membrane potential at a cell level, for example, to blood flow at organ or system level. And that's basically what we try to do. And one of those models, the one that we developed in Maastricht, but there are others that you can use, really depending on the research question you have. Well, the model that we developed is CircAdapt. You may have heard of it or not. You can always visit the website. I will show that later. Because it's open source and more groups in the world are using this platform for cardiovascular research in different fields. Well, all cardiovascular, of course, but in different pathologies, I would say. The unique feature here is that it's a very modular model. That means that we sort of subdivide it the system, that complex cardiovascular system, in building blocks, basically. And those building blocks, for example, are vessels. And vessels you can describe by assuming certain physical laws. And in essence, an artery does not behave differently physically than a vein, albeit that the tissue properties are rather different. And that makes them behave differently if you measure and observe, for example, a pressure-area relationship. But the same physics apply. And that is what we mean as modelers by a module, that the physics is the common ground, but that the properties defining the constitutive behavior of the material can be different. So our system we built from a vessel module, a myocardium module. We also have a microvasculature, which basically is a flow-dependent resistance. And all these processes you can actually describe by mathematical equations that cover the physical and physiological knowledge that we have. And much of that is derived from, for example, cellular experiments or whole organ experiments. Okay, so that we then, of course, put into computer language, and I don't want to bug you more with what exactly modeling is, but this gives you an impression of what we mean by modeling. In the end, this leads to a rather unique tool that simulates real-time the pressures, volumes you see here, flow velocities across valves. Here I display the mitral flow velocity, so the filling of the left ventricle, and in dark red, it's the aortic flow velocity. We have also stress and strain at the tissue, so we can also investigate what happens at the tissue level and how that translates into pump function or dysfunction. And well, here on the right, you can see how you can change properties of the myocardium, for example, or general properties like heart rate, AV delay, or mean arterial pressure. And as soon as you change something in this tool, you immediately see the consequences on the hemodynamics. Here you see a very quick simulation of something we could call left bundle branch block, which I will talk about later this afternoon. So if you want to play with this yourself, you can download the tool for free. So this is actually a user interface we developed for teaching cardiovascular physiology and pathophysiology. And in Maastricht, we use it for teaching medical students, but also biomedical engineers from Eindhoven. And students really like it because it moves and you can create your own patient rather than reading boring textbooks, let's say. Okay, so you know, the CircuitApp framework is built, well, based on more than 30 years of academic research. So it was being developed or founded, let's say, already before I started doing research. And through the years, it became more complete in the sense that we nowadays can also simulate the coronary system, for example, but also calcium contraction coupling at the subcellular level, for example. That's actually our latest extension of the model. And that makes it very versatile. You don't need all this complexity for every research question. Nowadays, we have a framework where you can easily use less or more complex versions of modules, depending on whether you need that to answer a research question. So we can really tailor the model complexity to the objective of the study, which I think is a rather strong aspect. Also, since this is not a full 3D biventricular model, but we really focus on a lower order description of first other effects of physiology and pathophysiology. It means that it's relatively low in its computational cost. You see, it's more than 100 times faster than real time, meaning that we can run many cardiac cycles in very little time. And certainly when you want to personalize a model to become a digital twin or a patient-specific simulation, that is really a big advantage. Okay, let's dive a little bit into the problem of left bundle branch block that is very common in heart failure patients. And I guess that quite a few of you know, but maybe not everyone knows, that this can be treated by a therapy called cardiac resynchronization therapy, a specific pacing therapy. Well, here you see the essence of the problem, and that is that the left ventricle, if I play back, so the left ventricle is actually delayed in its electrical activation due to, let's say, some problem of the fast conducting system on the left side. And that means that especially the left lateral wall is very delayed in its electrical activation relative to the septum and the right ventricular lateral wall. So the therapy that we know and that has been proven very successful is cardiac resynchronization therapy, where basically two leads are implanted, one on the right side, one on the left side. And by stimulating them in a certain sequence, usually pretty simultaneously, we create two activation waves that that aim to at least partially resynchronize the electrical activation of the left and the right ventricles. Okay, so the selection of patients is really based on an ECG and also echo, but when it comes to echo, it's based on ejection fraction, which gives quite a fair image of the systolic pump function, but we also know that it's very aspecific. So on the ECG, there needs to be a wide QRS for sure, and the highest clinical indication for CRT is given to patients with a left bundle branch block morphology in addition. Now, where comes mechanics in? Well, if we have an ECG like this, and this, let's say, is a typical LVB patient, but let's say this is a normal ECG, so a narrow QRS, no conduction problem, then you expect strain patterns. So here we have a strain pattern, meaning that this is contraction of the tissue and this is lengthening, typically in two phases, the early and the late filling phase. And during the ejection phase, you see that all pieces of tissue here, this of the septum and the left lateral wall, that they're actually working in harmony. They're contracting simultaneously with basically the same amount, and also filling in harmony. In a left bundle branch heart, it typically looks like this. We have the early activated septal patterns here, yellow, turquoise, and green segments, where they shorten, and they shorten actually before the aortic valve opens. While at the same moment, the lateral wall is being stretched. That's what we see here. It's being stretched. And that's because it's still inactive. It's not activated electrically. And if you're not electrically activated as a cardiomyocyte, you cannot develop force. So at that same moment, your neighbors, the septum, is actually pulling at you because it's developing force already, and it's stretching the lateral wall. A little bit later, the lateral wall also gets activated, and then it starts shortening. But at that moment, it's pre-stretched, and it's much more strong than the septal wall. And that's a phenomenon, by the way, that all of you should know, and that is called the Frank-Starling mechanism. But then at the cellular level, if you pre-stretch a myocyte in the diastolic phase before electrical activation, it will develop more force and for longer than when it's less stretched. So that's the interaction you see here. So during the ejection phase, you end up with an early activated tissue that is weaker because it's less pre-stretched, whereas that same tissue pre-stretched the late activated tissue, the lateral wall, which becomes stronger, at least when that intrinsic length dependence of activation is still intact. So this is what we call a very typical left bundle branch block mechanical pattern. And in the end, that leads to less efficient pump function than when it would be synchronous. So you basically lose energy. So how this works, you can see here in this animation, what you see going back and forth is a delay of the left ventricular free wall, and those are simulated data. So on the left, you see pressure volume data and flow. So that is really pump function. And this is local tissue mechanics. And what we demonstrate here in red is the early activated septal tissue, and in black is the late activated lateral wall tissue. So here is tissue and here is pump. Of course, this tissue function underlies the pump function here. I mean, the red and the blue curves, the blue and the green curves are basically the result of the red and the black curves. And what you see typically here is what I also demonstrated in the previous slide. You see the early activated tissue shortening here prematurely before the aortic valve opens, and at the same moment it stretches the late activated lateral wall. What is important here is those loops. So this is stress strain loops, and the area of the stress strain loop is really the amount of work performed by the tissue. And that needs to be matched by perfusion, as you know. The coronary circulation, the perfusion of tissue is being matched to its demand. And the area of this loop is basically the energetic demand of the tissue. And there you see that with a delay of activation of the lateral wall due to left bundle branch block, that you get a huge divide, a huge difference in demand, in energetic demand. You see the black loop increasing in size, so it actually performs more work than it does under synchronous conditions, whereas the red loop actually reduces in area and even becomes, let's say, 0. So there is no area anymore, meaning that it hardly contributes to the pump function or the pump action of the left ventricle. So you expect the demand to be very low. And experiments in the past have shown indeed in dogs, so those were experiments done by the lab of Professor Fritz Prinsen in Maastricht. In the early days, they showed that if you induce left bundle branch block in those dogs and you follow up, you see that the septum actually becomes thinner, whereas the lateral wall, the late activated lateral wall, becomes thicker. And that's exactly what you would expect if you look at these mechanic consequences of left bundle branch block. Okay, you also see here, for those who are familiar with M-mode images on an echo device, you see this septal flash, which is typically occurring in left bundle branch blocks. It's how it's originating from the activation delay. Okay, so about 10 years ago, let's say, we were contacted by a group in Utrecht. Those are clinical researchers. They were very interested in strain measurements. At that time, strain measurements was really a new thing and was quite popular, especially in left bundle branch block patients. And the reason is as follows, is that in a normal heart, you expect a septal deformation like this. this looks absolutely normal. That's also what our model simulates if we simultaneously activate the walls of the LV and the RV. However, in 130 heart failure patients, they observed very different patterns in the septum, even though the electrical signatures in terms of the 12-lead ECG were pretty similar. So all those patients had an LVUB morphology and white QRS complex. You see here a pattern that we called at the time a double peak pattern, and you recognize this pattern because I just showed it on the previous slide. This is a typical left bundle branch block deformation of the septum. Premature contraction and then stretch during the systolic phase, well, the ejection phase in between those green dashed lines. Then there was a group with premature septal contraction or shortening, and then continuous stretch during the ejection phase. And then a third group with premature septal shortening, but a continuing shortening with a late systolic peak in the ejection phase. So the question to us was, can you give mechanistic insight in why those septal patterns are so different, even though the electrical conduction delay seems to be similar? So what we did as a first trial was bloody obvious, I think, is that we started delaying the lateral wall in our CircuitApp model without changing any tissue properties other than the onset of mechanical activation. And step by step, and this is what actually was shown on the previous slide already, you see that simply creating this mechanical activation delay from the septum to the lateral wall gives a mechanical behavior that is very similar as the one measured in this group of patients. So in order to get from this delay here of a 60 milliseconds, we keep that the way it is. We are not touching that because all those patients have that electrical delay. So in order to get this typical pattern here, we needed to create a contractile difference between the septum and the lateral wall. So if we make the septum less contractile, that's what we did here, we end up with a pattern that indeed stretches all the way during the ejection phase, which starts to look like this pattern observed in this patient. It's not exactly the same, but it shows the same characteristics. Interestingly, if we reduce contractility in the entire left ventricle, we actually move back to a septal deformation pattern that is very similar to the one observed in those 70 patients. So the majority of patients actually had such a late peak pattern. And well, what our model predicted was that those hearts were most affected in terms of myocardial failure. That's what the model predicted. And what we didn't know at that time, but the Utrecht group, of course, knew this, but they didn't share that with us, is that the group with such a pattern here, they actually didn't respond that well. Actually, they didn't respond at all. After 6 months, there was hardly any change of ejection fraction or in systolic volume, which are very common outcome measures if you look at LV reverse remodeling after a CRT. Whereas the one with the double peak pattern definitely showed most therapy effect. And also the early peak pattern was not too bad, let's say, in terms of response. Those were called responders, and this is really non-response. Okay, so now quite a few years later, we did a lot more computer simulations, but also in vivo experimental animal, but also human research in patients. I mean, and now we know that beyond the electrical delay that is present, the way the electrical delay is translated into a mechanical consequence is pretty much modulated by non-electrical factors, like is there a scar, is there ischemia, is there fibrosis in the tissue? And not only that, also where is that? Is that in the late or the early activated regions? So all those patient-specific characteristics actually determine how the electrical delay is being translated in a regional mechanical abnormality, and that, of course, determines how good or bad pump functions. So that's why I still think that mechanical assessment through echo can be very valuable and of added diagnostic information to the current guideline criteria, even though the measurement of those strain patterns is not easy. But I think that's a matter of time, because all the large imaging companies are really using the best of AI to make things simple for a cardiologist in that sense. Okay, so well, in this slide, it shows that with the same electrical substrate, basically, you can have very different mechanical patterns, and all related to a different status of the pump function. So if we have hypocontractility or stiffness of the myocardium, both of them are associated with high filling pressures and most severe symptoms, let's say, but both of them actually conceal the typical left bundle branch block mechanical pattern. And in a way, we can also understand that, because if you have hypocontractile or stiff myocardium, you actually lose the ability of the early and the late activated tissue to interact and to respond to each other. So, and that is different in where we have an electrical substrate pure. So this is normal myocardium, let's say, and where you have a centric remodeling, but not necessarily a loss of contractility and increased stiffness. So from this work, the problem is that if you come across a patient in the outpatient clinic, you actually have no clue where the patient started and where he is at that moment. Well, and that makes it difficult to say something about how LBUB caused heart failure, or is it heart failure that caused left bundle branch block? We simply don't know in most patients. So the question here was that, having this mechanistic knowledge, can we design a diagnostic measure that actually integrates all this and enables us to predict response to CRT better than the current guideline criteria? Well, that's quite a difficult objective, let's say. But what we did is we simulated many patients, so virtual patients. And the nice thing about this model is that you can vary the underlying disease substrates. So we can give them all LBBB, some a bit more, some a bit less. We can even simulate non-LBBB patterns of electrical dysynchrony. But we also give them different myocardial substrates like hypocontractility or increased stiffness, fibrosis. So that's what we did. And then we apply the same therapy to all these virtual patients. So we resynchronize them. And that led to a statistical study here on these virtual patients. You could call it an in silico trial. And since we have now the acute mechanical hemodynamic response per virtual patient, we could correlate that to specific baseline characteristics, which we all had in those simulated patients. And there we learned that LVB substrate and eccentric remodeling really increases the systolic stretch. in the lateral wall and the septum, and that all the bad things like contractile failure and increased stiffness, those are substrates that we assume are hypothesized to actually work against LV reverse remodeling, they actually decreased SSI. So SSI is basically the outcome of this study, is the biomarker that we defined as being a good integration that can predict response. That was the hypothesis. Well, we tested this in a larger database. So this is from a Medtronic study, the adaptive CRT study, and we got access to the echoes without having access to the outcome data. And there, indeed, we see if we do in those 440 patients, if we look at high SSI and low SSI patients, and we do quartiles, we see that the lower SSI, the worse the outcome is, independent on the electrical criteria, etc. Okay, so, well, that is a conclusion on this, that I believe that looking at the mechanical behavior of the tissue regionally of the heart can be quite meaningful. Well, we're now quite a few years later. The guidelines haven't changed, and I think there is good reasons for that, because measuring strain is not necessarily easy. I mean, having an ECG is quite easy. But it's, I think, maybe something for the future when things do become easy due to technological advances, where people will realize that in the idea of personalized medicine, that I think we can't go around mechanics. But that's for later. Okay, so the same model we recently also used. This is a former postdoc in my group, Paul Nijberg, who looked into the mechanical consequences of different versions of conduction system pacing. So what he did is he developed a 3D biventricular iconal model with quite a few assumptions on fiber directions, but also a fractal tree to simulate the conduction system, and also some transmural conduction assumptions. And he cut that heart into the typical, let's say, echo-based or imaging, non-invasive imaging-based patterns. So these segments. So that was basically a 18-segment left ventricular model, but also the right ventricle. And we were very interested in what those conduction system pacing configurations, what they do to the right heart, because that has not been studied at all at this point. And here you see some results, how, for example, a right ventricular apex pacing compares to biventricular pacing or left ventricular septum pacing. So you see quite some differences in right ventricular activation, but also left ventricular activation. Here with left ventricular septum pacing, you still have quite some delay with the lateral wall, even though that is much less than what you have with right ventricular apex pacing. Well, these numbers then serve as input to CircAdapt, and here we have 3 other configurations, so left bundle branch pacing and his bundle pacing. But if we insert that into CircAdapt, we get actually the regional mechanics. And once again, these lines should be as narrow as possible, because the more they are on top of each other, the more mechanically uniform and synchronous the heart pumps, and therefore also the most efficient. So here, well, it won't surprise you that his bundle pacing actually gives the best outcome in terms of mechanical dispersion. But you see that selective left bundle branch block pacing and non-selective left bundle branch block pacing are not too far off, I would say. And also that if you have selective left bundle branch block pacing, that the pre-stretch, so the delay of right ventricular free wall activation is a bit larger than when it's non-selective left bundle branch block pacing. So these are predictions of the models from which you can derive hypotheses, and those then serve as input to new clinical study designs. At least that's the way we work in Maastricht. Okay, this is workload. I'm not going into detail. And of course, we can stretch this to pump function. And then you see that, well, this is all relative to right ventricular apex pacing. So basically, all those configurations, whether you look at LV or RV indices, they're all better than right ventricular apex pacing. And the differences are not that large, I would say, except that, well, the left bundle branch block pacing in terms of DPDT max, they are quite a bit better than BIV pacing. But there are other indices that actually where it's the opposite. Okay, but from this, we concluded that selective left bundle branch block pacing, so the best intra left ventricular resynchronization, but a delayed activation and impaired pump function of the right ventricle. And the question is whether we want that. And if you look at the studies being done at this moment, also the trials, they still focus on the left ventricle only, most of them. So we'll see, and time will tell us whether a delay in RV activation becomes a problem in the long run. That's something that can only be investigated clinically. But at least in Maastricht, these results have led to the ongoing and upcoming prospective trials in conduction system pacing, always to also look at the right ventricle, which I think is important. At least the model predicts so. Okay, so what I've shown here is mostly what we call forward simulations. So we have this model, we change some properties, we look at what the model predicts, what the consequences are for regional mechanical or pump function, hemodynamics. And from that, we learn and we develop new research questions. We hypothesize, which can either be tested again in virtual patients or can also be used as a source of inspiration for new clinical studies. But of course, it would be nice if we could personalize the model and look whether we can predict what would be the best for the individual patient. And that is what we call the digital twin concept. I'm sure that many of you have heard of it because it's quite a hot topic, but it's also an umbrella term, and many people define this in a different way. So that's why I give our definition, the way we look at it. And of course, it doesn't surprise you that we use our CircAdapt system for that, meaning that we actually use an individual patient's non-invasive diagnostic data that can be echo, it can also be MRI or blood pressure measurements. And we try to personalize our model, which is basically knowledge-driven, because it actually contains the physics and the physiology that we put into it through the mathematical equations. And we try the output of the model to be as representative as possible for what we have measured in the patient. And then you end up with a digital twin, which then can be used for diagnostic support. So it can give more insight into the intrinsic properties of vessels or the heart or valves that we cannot directly derive from the individual measurements that are clinically available. And from that, if we know our digital twin is representative and reliable, then we could also apply virtual therapies in that in silico environment. For example, a pacemaker therapy that's easily simulated in our model. So this is an example. This was a study published beginning of this year, done by my PhD student, Tijmen Koopsen. And what he did, he took 45 CRT candidates where we had high quality echo data from, or at least what we got from the Utrecht group. Again, we actually got strain patterns and volume data. So the end diastolic and systolic volumes of the left ventricle. And well, one back again. So this is the classical clinical pathway. People make an ECG, an echo, and based on this information, together with the patient, it is being decided yes or no implantation of a CRT device. And typically in the studies or the clinical trials, we follow up after 6 months or 1 year to see has the left ventricle become smaller and have the symptoms being improved. So what we propose here in this study is that we actually use the strain patterns in addition to the ECG, as well as the ventricular volumes. So everything you can get a baseline before implantation, and we personalize the model to fit those data and then apply virtual pacing and to see whether the acute hemodynamic or mechanical response we observe in the digital twin is somehow correlated or associated with the real world outcome after this intervention. Okay, but if that works well, there is actually a very pleasant side product, and that is that we actually quantified the active, passive, and also electrical. That's not really the focus, but mostly the active and the passive myocardial tissue properties, which may be of diagnostic information. So to give you an example, this is a real patient's measurements. And for those who are trained in looking at strain patterns, you would immediately recognize that this is a typical left ulnar branch block patient. Especially here in this image, you see again the early septal activation or contraction basically, and then the typical stretch during ejection, whereas the lateral wall is being pre-stretched and actually contracts much more forceful or more shortens more than the early activated septal tissue. So if we tell the model to seek for the tissue properties that best mimic this behavior, it actually can find a combination that produces a regional behavior that is very similar. To me, this is really amazing. This is, of course, a good patient, let's say, in terms of that the model could very well reproduce those strain patterns. And what I didn't talk about yet, for those of you who are more into the technological aspects of these kind of studies, what we did ensure is that this is a unique and reproducible solution. And that actually took 4 years to develop an algorithm that actually can estimate tissue properties from regional strain patterns in a unique and reproducible way. And that's not a given. That's very difficult. But I won't go into detail here, but we have published several studies about that, several papers. What we did see, so this is now the digital twin of the baseline condition of that patient. And you typically see the huge divide in workload, even negative work in the septum and large workload in the lateral wall. It's exactly what you expect. But I also explained in the beginning that this workload difference is actually a very good sign, because it tells us that the intrinsic, let's say, Frank Starling property of the tissue is still intact. And I expect that this will be a responder because of that. Well, if we do the pacing in this virtual patient, you see that the mechanical behavior of the walls or the segments becomes more uniform, but it's not perfect. It's not what you would expect from a fully synchronous part. Well, that's also to be expected because the electrical activation that we synchronize now is not affecting the regional differences in contractility and stiffness. For that, it needs to be a chronic response that maybe reverses the disease substrates or not. You can also see that the workload is now at least slightly more equally distributed. And it's exactly the difference between the workload at baseline versus in the virtually paced configuration. That is what we quantified and said to be representative for the let's say, the potential for response. And if we plot that pacing-induced work redistribution against the real patient outcome, meaning reverse remodeling after 6 months, so this is real patient data, this is from the digital twin, we do see quite a nice correlation. And we didn't expect this to be perfect at all, because there are so many other factors that influence CRT response that we do not model, that we do not include in our virtual patient. But still, to me, it's quite cool and quite promising that actually the virtual pacing based on baseline information only actually is associated with the real patient's outcome. So here you also nicely see that basically all blue dots were the ones with a class 1 indication from the guidelines, and they all actually responded, some a bit less, some very clearly in terms of reverse remodeling, and that our model prediction actually goes along with that, and that the ones with a class 2A or B indication, according to the guidelines, actually do not necessarily respond and also have less pacing-induced work redistribution. What is interesting, I found, is that this is due to the ESC 2013 guidelines. Some of you may know that recently in 2021, the guidelines have changed. And specifically, the left bundle branch block definition has changed. If you apply those new guideline criteria to that cohort, you see that many of the patients who actually did respond very well and are also expected by the digital twin to respond would have gotten a class 2 indication according to those new guidelines. So I think this is sort of a wake-up call that the new guideline criteria are way too strict and not necessarily reflecting the potential for response, which is worrying, I guess. Okay, so with that, I would like to conclude. Well, this one I showed already. I think the latter part is about inverse solutions, patient-specific modeling, where we can integrate imaging-based diagnostic information in a personalized model, a digital twin, which can expose hidden disease substrates that would remain concealed otherwise, but also we can actually virtually apply therapies and see which therapy would be most beneficial. And what I haven't talked about yet is that, of course, we can also simulate different device settings and see whether we can optimize the therapy based on the specific patient's underlying disease. So with that, I summarize with these general conclusions, stating that, well, I think in general, computer simulations can be very useful, and that also in Bordeaux, they make use a lot on EP models and different kinds of computer models of the human heart and its function. And I think we should all consider this to at least collaborate with people doing it or do it yourself if you're in preclinical or clinical research in the cardiovascular field. So with that, I would like to thank also my team and collaborators. You see here there quite a few people with an engineering background, but also a medicine background in my group, and also in our institute with the clinical group here from the cardiology department. We collaborate on a daily basis, and that's really what I like about the Maastricht, let's say, ecosystem, that it's the modeling work is adopted very well. Okay, with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer all your questions. I expect that there are quite a few, and I also want to take the opportunity to do a little bit of advertisement for those of you active in the digital health field. I'm involved in one of the journals in that field specific to cardiovascular disease, and please submit your great work to our journal. Thank you. Questions? No questions?
Thank you so much, Professor Lumens, for your presentation. I have a question about the model of the left bundle branch block. Because recently I have read a newspaper, an article in circulation in about 2018. It's from the Fredericton, from Arizona, from Center of Heart in Phoenix in the USA. And this is a seminal paper because they demonstrating that because of the left bundle branch block, it is there's about 20 to 30% that block is occur proximally. So just around his bundle, so he has an idea like that because we have a part of the population with a block, proximal block. So they are really can be treated by the conduction system pacing, the left bundle pacing. But with the rest, we have the block quite distal. So we cannot treat it with the conduction system pacing like the left bundle pacing. So do you have any idea to predict what the patient, what population of the RBDP they has a tendency to have a more proximal block or distal block, because we can predict what patient is responsive to the left bundle pacing or what patient is responsive to the CRT only. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. As I understand it well, you're asking whether it's maybe possible to predict upfront what the where the exact block is, whether it's proximal or distal, and therefore also whether it would be best to do a specific conduction system configuration in a patient. That's a very important but very difficult question, I have to say, because I think the best way to figure that out is in the EP lab when you are able to pace, but then it's too late, of course, because you're in the procedure, and that's difficult. Whether there are certain mechanical signs that are maybe showing where the exact problem is, whether it's more distal or more lateral, or I don't know. I think it's too early to say something about that. Our modeling work does not specifically simulate the exact, let's say, electrical conduction. So we always make assumptions there. So that will be difficult. Maybe there will be some EP modeling or like ECG imaging data that could provide more insight than that. That I do believe, but I think those data don't exist yet. Then the other thing I wanted to say about conduction system pacing, what we did is we did with the iconal model, we did selective, non-selective, and left bundle area pacing. And the latter, we actually don't model any capture of the fast conducting system. So we did assume an endocardial fast conducting layer, but not necessarily the Purkinje fiber network. And that does already help. But as you can understand, when you capture the fast conducting system, it becomes less desynchronous than when you do not. So that will have mechanical consequences. Anyway, it's a long answer to your question, but it's also a very difficult one. I think it's most likely that those answers lie in EP data rather than mechanics. That's what I would expect, but I'm not sure. Any other question?
Actually, one short question. You showed the strain curves, and in one of the curves that was in the background, there was, I think it was the range, basically transparent for each curve. I guess it was the range. So I was wondering how you get the range of the curves out of the system, out of the model.
So I did not fully understand, but the range of strain, or can you please repeat? Because I don't hear it very clearly.
It's the strain curves, and it appeared to me that there was also a range plotted for each strain curve.
Yeah, I will show you. Now I understand what you mean. Yeah, it's this one. So these ranges are the ranges of that particular wall. So we have the interventricular septum in red, and the interventricular septum in this configuration consists of 6 segments. So each segment has its own strain, and they actually cover this range. So you see here, for example, those 6 segments cover quite a range of different patterns, whereas the actual line is the average behavior of those 6 segments. Same holds for the lateral wall, so the left ventricular free wall, which consists of 6, 12 segments. So those 3, those 3, those 3, and those 3. The average behavior of that is the green line, but individually they vary in this envelope. I hope that answers your question.
Potentially related, so you mentioned that you also simulated basically the activation times and then used it as an input for the circuit apps model.
Yeah.
So I was wondering on what resolution. Is that also basically the activation in those same segments, or is it in a higher spatial resolution?
No, this is a very low and coarse resolution. That's segmental level. Yes. So our model is, which sounds a bit strange, but we have a 0D model basically, meaning that our segments are put in series there is no transmural component. This is the average activation delay in a segment. So the fully 3D transmural mesh that we have in the iconal model is completely, let's say, flattened to a 0D activation, because we think that the average activation time of a segment is basically the first order mechanical component. We do know that there is also transmural differences, of course. That's not captured by this model. So it's the resolution of the circuit app model is at the level of the resolution of the measurements that we obtain from echo. That's a segmental level and not deeper than that. Yeah. Any other questions?
Well, we should thank him. We should tell him that there's no moderator here. So thank you very much, Dr. Lumens, for your excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a great remainder of the summer school, and enjoy Bordeaux, and enjoy the game this evening. I think the French will watch the match against Austria. Good luck with that. Cheers. Bye-bye.